Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us today to mark the first anniversary of the COVID-19 global pandemic. As I stand here before you, I look back at the last 12 months and my heart holds a range of feelings, from grief and sorrow to gratitude and hope. We continue to go through this horrific pandemic. Despite the warnings to observe physical distancing and wearing masks, we see others ignoring these pleas, placing many at risk. We continue to go through painful reminders of structural racism, systemic oppression, and injustice. And despite protests, we continue to witness of yet another police brutality, another violent event. Despite the progress in dismantling racism, we continue to encounter various forms of racism and racial bias against our friends, loved ones, and colleagues of color. So much pain and suffering. There has been a strong sense of disorientation among many of us. The many things that we relied on for safety, for security, for survival, that include relationships, jobs, homes, have been upended. Dogen Zenji, a Zen master, said, "A flower falls even though we love it, and a weed grows even though we do not love it." Over the past year, we continue to learn to expect the unexpected, that we can never know how a moment, a day, a week will turn out, that the best made plans at the start of the week may not pan out. And yet, we also experienced that the unexpected brought us many things. The unexpected encouraged us to be open. It allowed us to trust the process. It made us touch again and again our anger, our fear, our despair, our loneliness, our longings, our exhaustion, our tears, and our sense of humor. It showed us our strengths, the depth of our resources and creativity. It called us to lean on one another. It jolted us out from our stupor. It stretched our souls. And it opened our eyes to abounding kindness and grace. It helped drill us down to what is most essential to us. It pushed us to let go of old notions and assumptions about ourselves, about others, about death, about life. And it gave us opportunity upon opportunity to make our lives a gift to others. Today we share sacred time as we come together in solidarity. Just by being here, we give comfort to one another. During this memorial service, Dr. Peter Slavin, Dr. Roger Pasinski, Nurse Terry Doherty, Nurse Deborah Washington, Dr. Kerri Palamara McGrath will share their stories, their grief and losses, the transformation they have experienced, and hopes as they look forward to the coming days. After each of them speaks, Reverend Donna Blagdon, Chaplain Julie Supple, and I of the Spiritual Care Department will perform a flower ritual to honor the memories, the losses, the sacrifices, the transformations that we have gone through, and the hopes that we hold dear in our hearts. As we go through the service, I invite you, if you're willing and able, to write in the comment box below the first name of a loved one whom you lost during the past year, a loved one whom you want to honor and remember. You may also share your thoughts and feelings with us. This will be our way of looking back. This will be our way of looking forward.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us at this service. This past year was one many of us would love to forget, but we must never forget. It was a little more than a year ago on March 4th, 2020, when 5 people who had attended an international biotech conference here in Boston arrived in our emergency room. They came seeking testing for a new threat that we had been hearing all about, learning about, and preparing for during the previous 2 months. March 4th, 2020 was the date that COVID-19 arrived at Mass General Hospital. It was also a command, March 4th, and our staff did just that. No one could have possibly imagined back then what a dramatic impact this virus would end up having on our lives and the world around us. Despite the unknown, despite the fear of their safety and the safety and well-being of their loved ones, our staff did what they do every day. They answered the call swiftly, compassionately, and brilliantly. From that very first day on, patients kept coming and coming and coming to receive the expert care here at MGH, and we were ready for them. We welcomed them, we cared for them, we interpreted for them, we cheered for them, and we cried for them. We also grieved along with their families who could not be there with their loved ones at the end, and we grieved with one another. During the past year, we have cared for 3,700 inpatients with COVID-19, and sadly, 300 of those have died here. We continue to grieve. There has been so much suffering, so much loss throughout this pandemic. The loss of loved ones, the loss of livelihoods. We felt a sense of loss when we couldn't spend holidays with families, when we couldn't socialize with friends. We experienced the loss of significant milestone events that we love so much, like graduations, weddings, and even funerals. But there have also been so many memorable moments, wonderful moments. Those were those times when patients who had been clinging to life on ventilators in ICU recovered and were discharged home to their families. Our hospital received overwhelming support and donations and cards and meals from a very grateful community. And the encouragement and reinforcement of our staff was truly inspiring to watch. Every day all around us were meaningful and poignant stories filled with hope, humility, and humanity. What struck me most during my visits throughout the hospital to our inpatient units, emergency departments, ICUs, outpatient practices, health centers, was the remarkable sense of calm, order, and determination, a sense I always feel when visiting parts of this hospital. Of course, there were enormous challenges to be dealt with, problems to be solved, but our staff worked together to figure out solutions and always did so methodically, thoughtfully, purposefully, with our patients and our communities foremost in mind. I hope we will always remember that day 1 year ago when we went to work and we also went to war. I hope we will carry the lessons of COVID-19 forward and apply them in ways that will enhance what we do in the future. I hope we will remember the compassion and support and sacrifice. And I hope we will remember the amazing innovation, science, and progress that arose from this pandemic. And most importantly, I hope we will remember the strength and resolve of the extraordinary people, patients, families, staff, and community, whose courage has been repeatedly tested and who have always shined so brilliantly through uncertainty, fear, and triumph. While we may want to forget this year we have just gone through together, it is vitally important that we remember always.
We place this flower to signal our openness to looking back and reflecting on the past year.
Thank you for allowing me to speak today at this event of remembrance. It truly has been a very surreal and remarkable year for me, for all of us, for our country, and the world. The deaths and losses have been on an unimaginable and staggering scale. Many of us have followed obsessively the daily and weekly stats at the local, national, and international level through the Johns Hopkins site and our own state tallies. The amount of data has been overwhelming. Today, however, I would most like to speak more to the personal and human aspects of the pandemic. We at MGH have directly experienced the pandemic through the individual patients that we have known and loved and cared for. So for me, as a primary care doc, I lost 5 patients. Some of these patients I have cared for 3 decades or longer. They were part of my, quote, MGH family, end quote. I knew their families, often extensively. For Mrs. M, I also care for her husband, her sister, her brother-in-law, 3 of her sons, and 3 grandchildren. And she knew my family also, always asking about my wife and my 2 sons in a very caring way. When my youngest son was in Liberia in the Peace Corps, she worried about his health and safety. She died early in the pandemic. She spent her last 2 weeks of life in the hospital without any visitors. On her last day, as the end was near and she was in a coma, a very compassionate hospitalist allowed her daughter to visit her, donning full PPE. As she held her daughter's hand, she opened her eyes one last time and then passed. As I think back over the year, I'm especially sad about the way our patients died, often tragically separated from their family, except for an iPad or a Zoom, and without the family hugs around the bedside that we all want in our final days. To cope, I always try to remember the humorous vignette or conversation or remarks that the patient and I shared in the good days. The follow-up visits when the blood pressure was improved or the edema had resolved. This anniversary week, I am also thinking about Mrs. H, who died 7 months ago. She always scolded me for running late and would call out to the passing medical assistant through the open exam door, "When is he coming in?" She loved Shakespeare, and she knew all the plays and the characters and the famous lines. So to soften her anger, I would ask her something about Shakespeare, and she would brighten and smile. "A rose by any other name would smell as sweet," was one of her favorite quotes. I hope during my remarks, many of your minds have drifted a bit and thought back about a dear patient, a dear friend, a family member, someone who you have lost over the last year. As humans, we remember, and that's what makes us strong. The bitter sadness with time becomes a sweet sadness. We can move forward again and continue our wonderfully special hospital work of caring. All the best to you listening today. Thank you so much for coming.
We place this flower in honor of all the patients and loved ones who have died over the past year.
At MGH, when it comes to taking care of our patients, nurses don't say no. We're all in. Whether it comes to being deployed to a different floor or returning to the bedside after years away or changing your shift, we said yes. We made sacrifices. I was on shift and I was taking care of a critically ill young man that had COVID, and he was on ECMO, and his wife called early in the shift and she was frantic because she needed to find a special card that he had on his possessions when he was admitted to the hospital, and she couldn't find it at home. And so besides taking care of him and making sure his blood pressure was okay and all the drips were full and he was adequately ventilating, I also was searching through his belongings at the bedside looking for this specific card. And after about an hour, I finally identified where it was. It was down in the safe. So I had someone run down to the safe for me and get the card so I could put all his belongings together. And then I called her back and we arranged a time to meet. And at this time in April, nobody was coming into the hospital. There were absolutely no visitors. So I was like, what are we going to do? How am I going to get this to her? And so I thought, okay, I'm just going to have her drive her car up around the front circle at Mass General, like right by the old emergency room. I'm wiping down all the belongings in his bag because at that point, we didn't know how contagious was COVID. Was that transmissible on his belongings and his clothing that he came into the hospital so critically ill with? Was I going to give it back to her to then reintroduce to her home and her family? So I was being meticulous, like all good ICU nurses are, and I was wiping down absolutely everything. And then I got a friend, another staff member, to come and help me double bag it and put it outside the room. And so then the time was approaching and I needed to get down there. There were 8 other ECMO circuits with 8 other young men on them as critically ill as my patient. And so I had to find somebody to cover for me, which doesn't sound like much on a regular, ordinary day, but in the pandemic, it was a lot. So I got someone to cover me for that 15 minutes and I'm rushing down there with the bag. And I'm thinking in my mind, oh, I hope that she's there and that she'll recognize me because she's only ever seen me in full PPE on a Zoom call. And I'm thinking maybe she'll recognize my voice or something about me. And so luckily for me, we were able to identify each other really quickly. And so through the passenger side, I handed all the belongings, which included the card and everything. And then she started asking me about how her husband was doing. And so I was updating her that he was doing a little better and we were hopeful. And then then I started to try and explain to her in Spanish, when my Spanish isn't the best, but I was trying my best to please wash down everything and to make sure that she washed her hands and to wear gloves handling that because we didn't know. And then she started to cry. And then I started to cry. And I thought, wow, all I really want to do is go to the other side of the car and just give her a big hug. That's all I wanted to do, but I couldn't. I had to stay behind my mask and try to emotionally support this woman whose husband was critically ill under my care in the ICU. And as I was going back up to the floor, I realized that the biggest sacrifice that I made during the pandemic was not the work. It wasn't the work or doing the physical job or taking care of the patients, but it was not being able to provide the physical and emotional care that I'd always given my patients and their family members. And I had to sacrifice that human touch, that human connection to keep everyone safe, to keep myself safe, to keep my family safe, to keep my coworkers safe, to keep the patients and their family safe. And that definitely still exists, and that still is probably one of the biggest sacrifices that I think most nurses at Mass General have had to make during the pandemic. And every day I think about getting back there, getting back to the nurse that I was and the one I still want to be. And I'm very patient and I'm hopeful and I pray that one day we can return to that.
We place this flower to recognize all of the many things we have had to give up over the past year.
March has been a mark of a crazy time for me. When I think about it now, I think about how frightened I was with the news of the virus. I never stopped coming to work. I came to work every day, took the T, and I am the stereotypical Black woman who grew up in the Black church. And so faith became an everyday lens for trying to figure out how to manage what was going on. So when I came to work, it felt library quiet, is the way I described it. There were so few people. I was the only one on the T when I would come to work, which was unheard of. And it just felt apocalyptic. When I get frightened, I always think about family. All my family is in the South, where I was born. I was born in Louisiana, so I immediately started making phone calls to my brothers and sisters to find out how they were doing. When you worry and when you love, you try to find some way to protect, not just family, but also friends. And that whole notion of loving and protecting really came home to me when I then started really paying attention to what was happening in the world at large. George Floyd, Black Lives Matter, social justice conversation. And for our Black family, that became our constant conversation about now the world is finally able to relate, to see. It's like the world had hit the pause button. I asked one person in particular, why are people recognizing all of the things that we've been talking about for decades since Dr. King? Why is it now capturing attention? Why is it now that people are able to tolerate the conversation? And the response I got from one person in particular took my breath away. And the response was, because we've never had COVID before. I said to myself, that's what it takes? It takes a pandemic to hit the pause button so people can see and understand what people like me have been going through for hundreds of years, decades, whatever. That's what it takes. But this awakening is something that it's real this time. And the reason why I believe it's real this time is because I see people doing things that I've never seen them do before. I see people connecting and being authentic with one another. And in my faith tradition, that always deserves an amen. One of the things that has been a joyous part of this experience since March is all of the new life that has come into my family. We have so many new babies in the family right now. And when I think about what that means for the future and this whole notion of finally, consciously, there's going to be change in the world. And I think about what that means to those new babies. I cannot wait for the next days to come.
We place this flower to acknowledge that everything changes, and to everything there is a season.
Merriam-Webster defines hope as a desire for things to change for the better and to want that better situation very much. Experts tell us that hope implies there is a possibility of a better future, that you believe that things will work out even if it seems otherwise. Hope gets us through the dark times. Or as Desmond Tutu said, hope is being able to see that there is light despite all the darkness. In fact, grief experts tell us that grieving is hope, that grief is our desire to work through the hard times, the hard feelings, so that we can get to a place where we feel better. This requires us to lean into that grief. We have all lost something during this pandemic, and that was not our choice. But we can choose to grieve our losses, work through them to find meaning, and in that process, we can hope for a better future. I can say personally, through my journey with grief and loss, that there have been times where I didn't know what hope looked like and wasn't sure I'd find it again. A therapist said to me, just because you can't see hope right now doesn't mean you are hopeless. Look for it in the little things. That helped me tremendously, whether it was in a butterfly in a flower bed, birds singing in the trees, leaves changing color in the fall, the laughter and silliness of my daughter, the quiet in a snowfall, or the hug from a friend. I welcome you all to give yourself grace through this process, knowing that there will be times when we are ready to find meaning and hope, and times where we just need to feel our losses. There will be times where we feel we have something to give, and others where we feel we need so much help. In those moments, please lean on each other. Lean on this MGH community to help you through the darkness. I'd like to share this poem written by Laura Kelly Fanucci about hope, written during the pandemic. When this is over, may we never again take for granted a handshake with a stranger, full shelves at the store, conversations with neighbors, a crowded theater, Friday night out, the taste of communion, a routine checkup, the school rush each morning, coffee with a friend, the stadium roaring, each deep breath, a boring Tuesday, life itself. When this ends, may we find that we have become more like the people we wanted to be, we were called to be, we hoped to be. And may we stay that way, better for each other because of the worst. My hope for you all is that you find the light despite the darkness and find meaning in your losses from this pandemic, and that we do that together as an MGH community. I leave you with a quote that has inspired and guided me through this time, which I found on a sign hung inside Boston Hope to support healthcare workers and patients during the pandemic. When it rains, look for rainbows. When it's dark, look for stars. Thank you.
We place this flower to open our hearts to the possibility of hope and healing in the coming year.
Thank you, Dr. Slavin, Dr. Pasinski, Nurse Doherty, Nurse Washington, Dr. McGrath, Reverend Blagdon, and Chaplain Supple for giving of yourselves in this memorial service. This pandemic spared no one. In one way or another, it made its grip felt in painful ways. I lost my father to COVID-19 in August last year in Manila, Philippines. He was healthy until COVID struck. When he suddenly had difficulty breathing, my sisters and nephews rushed him to the ED. He died on arrival. He was an anesthesiologist, and he left a promising practice in New York City in the 60s to return to his hometown in northern Philippines to realize a boyhood dream of serving his people. My father had soft eyes. Soft eyes were a quality of his that I continue to aspire to have. To look and see with soft eyes is to look and see with gentleness. It is to look and see clearly and without prejudice. It is to look and see with openness, to look and see with generosity. To look and see with soft eyes is to see reality in its bare and naked form and formlessness. It is to see the other as no other than us. It is to see reality as seamless and indivisible. All throughout the past year, I have experienced soft eyes from many of you. The kindness, the gentleness, the deep caring for one another as we sat in the pit together, in the pitch black of night. And because we are all in this together, we can hope. As writer Elie Wiesel said, I know the paths of the soul overgrown often know only the night, a very vast, very barren night without landscapes. And yet, I tell you, we'll get out. The most glorious works of man are born of that night. There are many things that give us hope, one of which are the growing numbers of those getting vaccinated each day. That has been a turning point for many toward the road of eventually being able to be in close proximity with loved ones, with friends, with one another, safely and with joy. To Chinese novelist Lin Yutang, hope is like a road in the country. There was never a road, but when many people walk on it, the road comes into existence. We hope that things will change for the better, especially when struggles wear us down. We hope when signs of improvement turn out to be a glint rather than a beam of light. We hope when we are afraid. We hope when the unknown looms before us. Our sense of hope, even the prospect of hope, whether or not it renders to something palpable, can be healing in itself. Hope lifts our spirits. In this spirit, I would like to invite you to come by the MGH Chapel at the end of this service to pick up cards with seeds of forget-me-nots. Plant these seeds in memory of those we've lost. Plant these seeds for our hopes now that winter has yielded to spring. We also have a special book in the chapel where you may write the first name of someone whom you will always want to remember. And as we go from this place, may all that is good, true, and beautiful be above us to guard, be underneath us to support, by our right hand to protect, behind us as a gift, in front of us to lead, round about us to shield us from storms, and within us as our strength and comforter. And as we go from this place, may you remember always that you are an amazing blessing to yourself, just as much as you are an amazing blessing to others.